Okay, so today's daf is Kuf Mem Vav 146. We're going to start with the new Mishnah at the top. Shover Adam et hachavit lechol hemena grogerot ubevad shelo yitkaven lasot keli. So it says that you can cut open the barrel in order to eat from it figs. So the barrel is full of dried figs, let's say. And so you can cut open the barrel in order to eat them. Ubevad shelo yitkaven lasot keli, as long as you don't intend to cut a nice hole in it. In other words, you can't make an opening. You can't fashion an opening in the barrel because that's improving the barrel, making it more useful. You can break open the barrel in order to get the food out of it. So this is similar to, you can tear open, let's say, a package to take food out, but you can't make an opening in a package so that it's easier to get the food in and out, because that's actually improving the vessel. You're not allowed to do that. And similarly, the way that they would have was they would have a barrel. The barrel would be open on the top, and there was a plug that fit into the top of the barrel. So that plug that fit into the top, it says you can't make a hole in the plug either. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, that's what Rabbi Yehuda says. V'chachamim matirin. The rabbis allow you to make a hole in the plug. We'll see what this means shortly.
The plug was made out of wax. Maybe.
It was made out of some other material, yeah. What exactly it was made out of? It could be wax, could be something else. But it was something separate that was stuck in to the top of the barrel. And if you made a hole in it, basically what you would be doing is like this. You have a cover of your barrel, but you have a hole in the cover, so it actually makes it really easy because nothing dirty will get into the cup, but you can get what you want to drink out of the cup. So it's like a top of a coffee cup that you can put on for traveling, so that it doesn't come out when you don't want it to, and nothing goes in that you don't want to, but you can drink from it. So Rabbi Yehuda says you cannot make a hole in the megufa, in the plug on top. You should either remove it completely, or leave it there, but you can't make a hole there. Now the Chachamim allow you, Rashi says, the inderch petach lechavit bekach, because it's not the normal way to make a hole in the top of the barrel. It's either to remove the top or to leave it. But people don't usually make a hole through the plug and leave the plug in. So it's not, why not just take it out? So since that's not the normal way, they say that it's not a problem. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't do it. Velo yikovenu mitzida, you cannot cut it from the side. You can't make a hole from the side. The Gemara is going to explain what that means. Vim hayta nekuva, lo yiten aleh sha'avam bnei shu mimarech. And if there's already a hole in the barrel for retrieving food from it, you shouldn't plug it with wax because what you're doing is you're going to smooth out wax over. You're taking the thick wax and you're going to smooth it out over the hole, and that's one of the melachot, mimareach. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Maseh balefnei Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai ba'arav. It once happened, a situation like this, in front of Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai in Arav, ve'amar, and he said, Choshishani lo mechatat, that I consider somebody who's closed up a hole in the barrel to possibly be liable for a korban chatat. In other words, it might be a biblical violation of Shabbat to close up this hole with wax. Now we get to the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yoshaya. Rabbi Yoshaya says, Lo shanu ela drusot, aval meforadot lo. That what are we talking about here when we talk about breaking open the chavit, breaking open the barrel in order to take out the figs? This is only talking about where you have these rings of figs. What they would have figs that were pressed together in a ring, and then they would cut up the figs. So it says that's when you can do it. But before a dot, if they're already separated and it's just individual figs in the barrel, you're not allowed to do it. So why would that be? For a dot lo, is that really true? They raised an objection. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, mevi adam et hachavit shel yayin umatiz rosha b'saif umanicha lefnei orachim b'Shabbat v'eno choshesh. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that you can bring your barrel of wine on Shabbat in front of the guests and cut off the top of the barrel and serve everybody, and it's no problem. So why can't you cut off the top of this barrel and take out the figs, whether they are separate inside or they're pressed into rings? It shouldn't matter. Hahi Rabbanan matnitin Rabbi Nechemya. Though that's because Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is following the opinion of the rabbis, but our Mishnah is following the opinion of Rabbi Nechemyahi. So, and what is the opinion of Rabbi Nechemya? You might remember that Rabbi Nechemya is the person who says you're only allowed to take a vessel on Shabbat, to move a vessel, if it's being used for its normal purpose. And in this case, what's the normal purpose of a knife? It's not to cut a barrel open, it's to cut food. So if you're picking up the knife in order to cut the figs because they're pressed into rings, then while you're doing that, you can also cut the barrel with the knife. But if you didn't need the knife to cut food because the figs were separate inside, Rabbi Nechemia wouldn't allow you even to handle a knife on Shabbat. It would be muktzeh according to him. And how do we know that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Nechemia? Why is he forced to assume that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Nechemia? And it's talking about pressed figs that are pressed into rings. Why don't we assume that really it's talking about loose figs? And we're following the rabbis, that they say you can pick up a knife for whatever reason you want. Amar Rava says matnitin kashite. It's because our Mishnah was difficult for Rabbi Oshaya. Why? Because he saw the Mishnah and he said to himself, why is it specifying dried figs? Why is that the case of the Mishnah? Why doesn't it just say there's fruit inside? Why doesn't it say there's wine inside? Why does it have to say dried figs? So it must be telling you that it's Rabbi Nechemiah's opinion, and we're talking about dried figs that are pressed into a ring. And why are you allowed to pick up the knife to cut open the chavit, to cut open the barrel? Because you also need it to cut the figs. Tanya Chada, we said in one braita, chotalot shel grogerot v'shel tmarim matir u'mafkia v'chotech v'tanya idach matir v'lo mafkia v'lo chotech. So again, it says that if you had, what they used to do was they would take unripe figs, and they would put these unripe dates, and they would put them into these little kinds of, they had these sort of receptacles that they would make out of the leaves of just sort of like the same material that we tied the lulav with, So they would take that same material and they would make these little mini baskets, and they would put the figs in there, the dates in there to ripen if they were unripe. Okay, and so they would tie them up like that, and you would get them sort of all tied up and they would make chains out of it. So you would have a chain of all these tied up dates inside these little containers, these makeshift containers. So it says that if you had these matir, you can untie them, umafkia, and you can tear them, v'chotech, and you can cut them. And the other braita says that matir, that you can untie them, but you can't tear the chains open, in other words, where they're tied together with a vessel, and you can't cut open the individual containers. In other words, they're individual receptacles and they're tied to other ones. There's a chain of them. So according to the first braita, you can untie, you can also tear and cut. According to the second braita, you can untie, but you can't tear and cut. And again, harabana lakashet, no problem. Harabanan Rabbi Nechemia, that one is the rabbis, one is Rabbi Nechemia, because Rabbi Nechemia is going to say you can't use a knife to cut the receptacles. You can only use the knife to cut food. And since you don't need to cut these dates, you can't cut the containers either. Detanya, as we said in the Braita, Rabbi Nechemia says, "Afilu tarvad v'afilu talit," even a spoon and even a talit, v'afilu sakin and even a knife. You can only carry them, you can only move them on Shabbat if you need them for their normal use. They asked Rav Sheshet a question. They asked him, "Mahu lemivraz chavita beburtia b'Shabbata?" Can you pierce a barrel on Shabbat using a spear? Okay? Now according to Rabbi Nechemia, of course not. But we're saying even according to the rabbis, can you pierce the side of a barrel with a spear to make a hole in it so that you can take the wine out or take the food out? So, what are we asking? Do we look at it, when you pierce the side, do we look at it as making a hole in the barrel, making an opening, and therefore it's prohibited because you're improving the barrel? Or maybe we're just looking at it that you're trying to show how generous you are by taking this big spear and making a huge hole on the side. You could have cut the top off or whatever else, but because you're using a spear, you're not doing it to make a nice, neat hole. You're doing it to make an opening so that people can take. It doesn't matter what the hole looks like. So you're not allowed to do it, he said, because really you're making a hole in the side. Okay? There is an objection. Then why does Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel say that you can cut the top of a barrel off in order to get the wine out? Hatam vaday la'ayin yafa kamechaven. Hacha im ita de la'ayin yafa kamechaven liftuche miftach. He said, over there, what would be the option? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says you can either take the plug out of the barrel and pour it, or you can slice off the top. So slicing off the top is a dramatic way of showing how generous you are. Because instead of taking the plug out, you cut the top off and say, hey, look how much I'm giving you, right? Same difference, though. Here, if you wanted to just make an opening, just take the plug out. Why would you pierce a hole in the side? Piercing hole. Yeah, a barrel or...
Not barrel.
Same, it's the same thing. It has a plug on top. So why would you have to make a hole in the side? You could just take the top off. And yeah, but if you're going to do that through the top, why would you do the side? So it's like, right. Yeah. So therefore he says that's why you could tell that the person's making an opening in the side to pour out of, to improve it. It says you can't make a hole in the plug. Amar Rav Huna says machloket lemala. This is only talking about on top of al minatzad divrei kol asur. That everybody agrees making a hole on the side you're not allowed to do. You're making a hole in the plug. That's where there's a machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Because if you look at the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda said you can't make a hole in the plug. The Chachamim allowed it. And then it says, don't make a hole in the side. So Rav Huna is saying that means don't make a hole in the side of the barrel. Everybody agrees you can't make a hole in the side of the barrel. But you can, according to the Chachamim, you can make a hole in the plug because that's an unusual way of opening it.
Why would anybody make a hole in the plug? I mean, I don't understand.
I don't know. Maybe to minimize the amount of dirt that can get in, because if you just take the plug out, like this, like we have these cups that have, tops, so there's a little hole on the top because it lets the liquid come through, but it wasn't normal to do that, I guess. They normally would just open it. V'Rav Chizda, v'aynu dekatani, and that's why it says lo yikoven mitzida. But Rav Chizda says machloket min hatzad, that aval al gaba divrei kol mutar, that really Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim are arguing about the plug itself, and they argue because Rabbi Yehuda says you're not allowed to make a hole in the side of the plug, and the Chachamim say you're allowed to. On top of it, okay. If you're doing it on top, everybody agrees you're allowed to. So he's changing it. He's saying if you want to make a hole on the top of the plug, that's fine. Because that's not normal way to do it. Because if you wanted the liquid to come directly out, then you would have just taken the plug out. If you want to make it on the side of the plug, so there he says also that's where the machloket is between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda says you can't do that. Chachamim say you can do that.
He's not talking about the side of the barrel.
Right, not the side of the barrel. However, he says, but when it says you can't make a hole in the side, that means the side of the barrel. Okay? So therefore, what do you have here? You have two arguments that you have two different versions here. That Rav Huna says that they're arguing about where in the plug are you allowed to make a hole, according to the Chachamim. Okay? On the top, yes. On the side, no. That's what Rav Huna said. Rav Chizda says no. The Chachamim actually will allow you to make a hole anywhere in the plug. You can make a hole on the top of the plug. You can make a hole on the side of the plug. The only thing you're not allowed to do is the side of the barrel is what you're not allowed to make a hole in, according to Rav Chizda. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, you're not allowed to make a new hole in anything on Shabbat. But if you want to add to a pre-existing hole by making it a little wider, you're allowed to. And there are some who say you can't even add. And everybody agrees that if there's already a hole and you plug the hole, now you can take out whatever the plug is and use it. Okay? Now, according to the first Tana, what's the reason why you can't make a new hole? Why does the Tana Kama say that you can't make a new hole, but you can add to the hole? What's the difference? In both cases, you're improving the vessel. Either you're making a wider hole, or you're making a new hole, but it's the same thing. In both cases, it's an improvement. Amar Rabba says, because from the Torah, what's the rule? An opening is only considered an opening if it's a two-way opening, meaning you're going to put in and you're going to take out. However, V'Rabbanan hu de gazur mishum lul shel tarnegolin de'avir le'iulei avira ve'la'apuke havla.
I think there's a different purpose to opening. One, when you empty the barrel, you have to have a hole for the air.
Right.
Oh, that kind of.
Right. So the Chachamim are saying,
in order to facilitate,
right. So now, what the Gemara is saying is that what are they that really, in order for, let's say for example, you make a hole in the side of something just to empty out the contents, just to empty it out, not to put anything in. So that's only asur midrabanan, because really biblically it has to be a hole, which is two ways. But what did the rabbis do? They were concerned because a person could make a mistake. Because you have a case like a lul shel tarnegolin, like a chicken coop. In a chicken coop, you might think that the only purpose of the chicken coop is really to put things in, for air to get in. Okay, but really it's also for the heat to get out. It's for both. But a person will think that's only a one-way hole, and they'll say, okay, no problem, I'm going to make a hole in the chicken coop because it's not a problem, because I just need the air to go in. It's only a one-way hole, but really it really functions two ways. So in other words, the point is that since there are cases where it's not clear, where we don't think about all the implications of the hole that we're making, that's why the rabbi said you can't make any hole in a vessel. Okay? And vimbala osif mosif, if you want to add to it, it's okay, because osofei vaday belul shel tarnegolem lo atei lo osofei. But since the original gezerah the original decree was based on a chicken coop, nobody's going to add to the hole of a chicken coop. Why not? Because mishum richasha, because you don't want vermin to get in. So therefore, they weren't concerned that somebody would add to a chicken coop hole. They weren't concerned, in other words, they didn't make a gezerah that you can't add to holes, because their main concern was with chicken coops, and chicken coops were not concerned about a person extending the hole. V'yesh omrim en mosifin, and there are some who say you can't add to a hole because zimnin delatikne meikara v'atela aruchebe, because there are some times where you're going to make a hole in the chicken coop and then realize that you didn't make it large enough, even for the purposes of the chicken coop, and therefore you're going to add to it. And in the end, Darash Rav Nachman Mishum Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Nachman taught in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Halakha ki Yesh Omrim, that we actually follow the opinion of the Yesh Omrim, of the second view, that you're not allowed to add to the hole either. So here we see that they modeled the gezerah, they modeled their decree after the case of the chicken coop.
But they still knew the stuff that Simeon was talking about? I mean, they were aware that
they viewed
let's in air as well as let's out.
They knew that that's what it did, but they didn't think that was the purpose.
That's pretty sophisticated.
But they didn't think that was the purpose. In other words, they thought that in the case of a barrel, they saw the opening in the barrel is to pour out the contents. Like you make a hole, let's say you open an orange juice container. Right. You're not thinking, I'm going to put things in the orange juice. You're thinking, I want to get it out. Okay? It works two ways, but you're not going to use it two ways.
And they knew that.
But in the chicken coop, it works two ways, and it's used two ways, because you want the air to get in for the chickens, and you also want the sirchon, he says, whatever, if they're, they make waste and excrement, whatever, and it makes it disgusting in there, you want to be able to air it out. So you want the air to go in and out from the chicken coop. So since it's working both ways, they made a gezerah that you can't make any holes, because they were worried you would make a chicken coop hole, and the chicken coop hole is a hole that actually functions bidirectionally. But they didn't make a gezerah that you couldn't add to the hole, because a person wouldn't add to the chicken coop hole, because they don't want to invite other animals to get in. However, the fact is that there are times where you might have made a small chicken coop hole and then realize you had to add to it, so it ends up being the same problem, that you're actually completing the hole that's a bi-directional hole on Shabbat. So that's why the conclusion was that you can't make a hole, you can't add to a hole to expand it on Shabbat either, because we're concerned that you might make a hole that is a bi-directional hole.
Mouse will enter any hole.
Yeah, even a small hole. A mouse can get under a door. They could squeeze themselves under if there's even a tiny space. It's true.
It doesn't sound like they were aware that they had to get air.
They said aviran. Oh, not the air pressure. No, maybe not that. Yeah.
The muscleized thread.
They just modeled it on the chicken.
Yeah, big yeah. And they agree that if there's already a hole and you plugged it, that you can open it. The only time you're allowed to replace, in other words, you have a hole in your barrel and you want to replug it. If it's in a place which lishamer, which is to guard and preserve the wine, that it not get ruined, or the contents that they not get ruined, that's okay. Aval lechazek asur. But if the purpose of plugging the hole was to hold the barrel together, because it actually is needed for the structure of the barrel, otherwise it's going to fall apart, you're not allowed to put it back in on Shabbat. Because if you take it out or you put it back in, that's actually like constructing on Shabbat, because when you take it out, it's going to fall apart. So, how do I know when a hole is plugged to protect the contents and when it's plugged to strengthen the barrel? Amar Rav Chisda says, if it's above the line of the wine, it's there in order to protect the contents, because there's a hole in the barrel and you don't want dirt to get in. If it's at the same level as the wine, in other words, where the contents are, it's parallel to the wine, so that, he says, that's to strengthen the barrel. But Rava says no. Even if it's at an equal level with the wine, that's still to protect the contents. What's a case where you're doing it really to strengthen the barrel? That's when it's at the very bottom of the barrel. In other words, even at the bottom of where the sediments are. Because there's so much pressure on that hole that if you unplug that hole, really the whole thing is going to start, all the pressure is going to come down on that hole and it could break it open. So that's why you need that. Replacing it would actually be considered like constructing the barrel, because otherwise the pressure that's exerted on that opening could even break open the barrel completely, and that's considered fixing it actually on Shabbat. Amar le Abai le Rava. Abai said to Rava, Tanya de Mesayalach, there is a braita that supports you. Bayit satum yishlo arba amot, parat lo petzimav en lo arba amot. Bayit satum eno mitame kol sevivav, parat et petzimav mitame kol sevivav. That there's a halacha that if you have a house in a courtyard, and there are houses, they share a courtyard together, so automatically a person who has a house in a courtyard is entitled to the 4 amot of space in front of their house. That part of the courtyard, in other words, they share a big yard, basically. That 4 amot, the 6 feet, let's say, in front of your door, belongs to you. Automatically. Okay, even if you lock your door up and you seal up the door. But if you take the pitzimav, if you take the frame away, the frame of the door away, now you're really sealing it. Okay, now you're really sealing up the house and showing it's like a box now. It's not a house anymore. Because not only did you close the door and lock up the door and seal the door, but you actually took the frame of the opening away. That's pitzimav. Those are like the pillars that would hold the door frame up. You took them away. So that, and similarly, if you had a house that had a dead body inside, okay, then, and you stand outside the house, you're not going to become tameh. But if you take the door frame away, it just becomes a box. Now the house is considered like a kever. It's considered like a tomb. And even if you're within 4 amot of the house, you're going to become tameh. So what's the point? When you close it up, when you seal it up completely, it's automatically considered to be now it's considered to be a new entity. It changes the status of the entity. Either it seals it off. In the case of the courtyard, it makes it no longer considered a house. In the case of a kever, it also makes it no longer considered a house. Now Rashi explains the significance of this here, and he says that one second, where is it? So he tells you. Oh, actually, I thought Rashi said it explicitly, but he doesn't say it. But basically, what's the point here? That if you, it does. That an opening is only considered sealed when it's absolutely sealed. So that means that even if you close the door and you kept it permanently closed and you glued it closed, it wouldn't matter until you take the frame away. So what's the idea? That a sealing of something, sealing it off, means removing the frame. So he says that shows you that you have to go to the utmost for it to really be considered a seal or a closure. So in the case here of plugging up the barrel, what's considered plugging up the barrel such that it's defined as actually sealing the barrel, and removing or replacing it would be considered fixing the barrel? Only if it is a plugging up of the barrel that's the highest level of plugging it up, which means it's plugged up in such a way that that's what's holding it together. But if it's anything less than that, it's not holding it together, then taking it out and putting it back in is not considered fixing it or demolishing it. So he's bringing an analogy to this case of the house that's sealed off by removing the frame. So, yeah.
I'm sorry, the 4 amos in the courtyard, in the common courtyard.
Right.
That's private property.
That's your private property.
So that includes transfer from public to private.
No, not for Shabbat. That's only for
it does work for Shabbat.
Property reasons. Yeah, only for property reasons. Yeah, that means like somebody can't leave their stuff right in front of your house, basically. And you can ask them not to walk there. So he's just trying to show you that closure, sealing, stima, has to be absolute for it to be considered really significant. And you see that from this case of the house, that absolute sealing off changes the status of the house. So govta. Now we talk about a govta. Govta means, Rashi says, what's govta? He says it means that you take a reed that's hollowed out and you stick it into the barrel to serve as a kind of spout. Okay, so can you do that on Shabbat? So Rav says you can't stick it in. Shmuel says you're allowed to stick it. Everybody agrees you can't cut a reed to fashion it to be a spout. And if it was already placed in before Shabbat, everybody agrees it's okay to put it back. The only question is, what if you cut it, but it wasn't a perfect fit? That one says that if you use, in other words, you never used it before Shabbat to make sure that it was perfect. This is the first time you're putting it in. So if you had already put it in before Shabbat and tested it, fine, you can put it back in on Shabbat, the spout. If you never even fashioned it, you can't cut it on Shabbat, that's for sure. But what if you cut it, but you haven't put it in yet? So you don't really know if it's going to exactly fit. So one says, don't put it in on Shabbat, because you might find out it doesn't fit, and you might cut it down to size, whittle it down to size, and that would be a malacha on Shabbat of mechatech. The other one says it's okay, we don't make a gezerah, that since you cut it before Shabbat, and it's to the best of your knowledge, it's the right size, we're not concerned that you're going to fashion it any further to fit the hole to serve as a spout. Ketana'eh, this is similar to a machloket, or this accords with a machloket Tanaim that we find elsewhere. In Chotchin Shfofer Yom Tov, it says you cannot cut a reed on Yom Tov, and certainly not on Shabbat. Nafla. If this reed that was a spout fell out of the barrel, you can certainly replace it on Shabbat, and certainly on Yom Tov too. Rabbi Yoshia mekel. Rabbi Yoshia is lenient. Lenient about what? Rabbi Yoshia Ahaya. Which case is he talking about? Ilema aresha hakavitaken mana. He can't be lenient about the first case because he can't be telling you that you're allowed to cut the reed to make a spout. Ela asefa. Is he lenient about the latter case when the spout falls out? But Tanakama nami mishra kasharei. Everybody agrees you're allowed to replace the spout if it fell out. Ela dechaticha v'lo mitakna. There must be a hidden case at issue here between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yoshia, which is the case where you cut it, but you didn't fit it in yet. Ika benayu. Mar savar gazrinan, mar savar lo gazrinan. That according to the Tanakama, we're concerned that since you didn't make it exactly perfect and test it before Shabbat, we're worried that maybe you're going to find out on Shabbat that it doesn't fit and you're going to repair it. And Rabbi Yoshia says we're not worried about that eventuality, and you can put it in even for the first time on Shabbat. The Rav Shisha Berei, the Rav Idi, Mishmei the Rabbi Yochanan, halacha Rabbi Yoshia, and Rav Shisha, the son of Rav Idi, said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the halacha follows Rabbi Yoshia, that as long as you cut it to the best of your ability before Shabbat, the spout, even if you didn't insert the spout before Shabbat, it's still okay. You can insert it even for the first time on Shabbat itself. Now, if you had a hole in the barrel, we said you can't spread wax over the hole. But mishcha, what about thick oil? Rav asar Shmuel sharei. Rav says you can't. Shmuel says you can. Man asar gazrinam mishum sha'ava. Rav says you can't because we're worried that if you use oil, you might use wax. And oil is not really considered spreading because it's not really solid enough to be considered spreading. But you might come to use wax. Man desharei lo gazrinan, and Shmuel says we don't make that decree. Amar le Rav Shmuel bar Rav Chana Rav Yosef. Rav Shmuel bar Rav Chana said to Rav Yosef, "Beferush amart lan mishmei de Rav mishcha sharei." How could you tell me that Rav prohibits you from spreading oil over the barrel to seal it? You told us that Rav says you're allowed to. Amar Tavut Rishba Tavut. The hunter said, Amar Shmuel said in the name of Shmuel, Hai tarpad asur. You can't use the leaf of a hadas, the leaf of a myrtle, as a spout in your barrel on Shabbat. My tama, what's the reason? Rav Yemar midifti amar gezerah mishum marzev. Rav Yemar midifti said that we're concerned that if you do this, you might make a real spout. In other words, you might make a real spout on Shabbat. If you use a makeshift spout, you might make a real spout. Rav Ashi amar gezerah shama yiktom. Rav Ashi says we're concerned you might break off the leaf. If we let you use the leaf as a spout, maybe you'll break off the leaf from the tree to use as a spout. That's what we're concerned about. My benai, what's the difference between them? That if you had already cut it before Shabbat and set it aside to be used as a spout, it would be okay according to Rav Ashi, because we don't have to be worried that you're going to tear it off on Shabbat, as long as it was set aside in advance for that purpose. Beisad, let's say you have some fabric that would be used, some fabric that would be folded up and used as a pillow. Okay, Rav Asar Shmuel Sharei. The question is, can you wrap yourself in this fabric and walk into the public domain? So you can't carry it into the public domain, but let's say you wanted to wrap yourself in this fabric, walk into the public domain, and now put it down on the ground and use it to sit on. Are you allowed to do that? So, certainly if it's soft fabric, that would be fine because you're wearing it. And if it's very rough fabric that would never be worn as clothing, it's very coarse, then you can't wear it. But but what about if it's somewhere intermediate between the two? The one that says you're not allowed to wear it, it says we're concerned it looks like you're carrying. And the one that says you're allowed says we're not worried about the appearances and you're allowed to do it. And this that we're attributing to Rav, that he doesn't allow you to wrap yourself in these fabrics and walk out on Shabbat, we inferred it from another statement that he made. He didn't actually say it. Because Rav once came to a place where there was nowhere to sit. And Nafak Yativ beKarmelit. He went and sat in the Karmelit. He went and sat in a semi-private, semi-public domain. Aitule Beisadya. They did this indirect carrying of fabric. They wrapped themselves in fabric and brought it out for him to sit on. But Lo Yativ, he wouldn't sit on it. Man dechaza, the person that saw it, savar mishum de beisadya asur, they thought that was because he thought that carrying it out like that was not allowed, so he wouldn't sit on it because he said it's not legitimate. You wrapped yourself in the fabric and brought it out in an indirect way. You're not allowed to do that. However, the reality was velohi. The Rav achruze machriz beisadya sharai. Actually, Rav held that it was okay. The only thing is, but because other rabbis didn't have a place to sit, he didn't want to sit there. He said, it's not nice. If everyone else doesn't have a place to sit, I'm not going to sit there. Umanin, who Rav Kahana and Rav Asi were there. They didn't have a place to sit. He said, if they don't have a place to sit, I'm not going to sit on a comfortable place either. But really, you're allowed, if you have medium coarse or soft fabric, you could wrap yourself, let's say, in a blanket or in fabrics or whatever. Yeah, you could wear it and then bring it out wearing it, and then put it down and sit on it as a comfortable place to sit. This is what the conclusion is. The Mishnah says, you can place food into a pit on Shabbat so that it will stay cool. And you can do the same thing by taking water in a container and put it into bad water, meaning you can take your nice water in a container and put it into outside water that's not clean, but it's cool to keep it cool. And you can take cold water and put it in the sun so that it will warm up a little bit. That's not considered cooking. If a person ends up falling into water or getting soaked in the rain on the way home and his clothes are soaked with water, he can walk with them on, it's no problem. When he gets to the outer courtyard, he can lay them out in the sun to dry. But not in public. He has to go into his own courtyard and do that because he doesn't want people to see it. What will happen? We talked about this before. People will see his clothes laid out in the sun and say, look at that guy. He washed clothes. He's doing laundry on Shabbat. Because he has wet clothes, he put them out to dry. Okay? So the Gemara says, Pshita ma'odetema, what's the reason why you have to tell me that I'm allowed to put food into a pit on Shabbat? What's a chidush here? Ma'odetema, nigzar mishum ashvuye gumot, kamash malan. You might have thought you can't put something into a pit on Shabbat because you might end up smoothing out the ground at the bottom of the pit. The answer is we're not concerned about that and it's no problem. You can put your water into cold water in order to cool off. Hanami pshita, this is also obvious. Ma'udetema, what might you have thought? Nigzor dilma atelat munei baremetz, that if I allow you to put your cold water into the sun to heat up, you might end up putting some other insulation around it, such as ashes or something else hot, around your water on Shabbat, and that would really be cooking. The answer is kamash malan. We're not worried about using the sun, that somebody will make a mistake and mistake the sun for actual hot material, because the sun is something else. So that you're allowed to do. Mishnishu kelav. So now we get to the last point for today, which is that Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Kol Makom Shasru Chachamim Pnei Marita Ayin Afilu B'Chadrei Chadrim Asur, that any time that the rabbis prohibited something because of appearances, because of Marita Ayin, like in this case, you have wet clothing. The Mishnah said you can lay them out in the sun, but not where people can see you. But Rav Yehuda says that actually no. Rav said, even though people can't see you, you're still not allowed to do it. Because once the rabbi said something is prohibited because of appearances, even in private it's prohibited. Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, Shotchan b'chama v'lo keneged ha'am. But what about the fact that we learned in our Mishnah that you can lay out the clothes in the sun, just not in front of people? So what's the problem? Obviously, if it's not in front of people, it's okay. Tana'ehi, it's actually machloket Tanaim. The Tanya, as we learned in the Brayta, Shotchan b'chama v'lo keneged ha'am. Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Shimon osrin, that you're allowed to lay it out according to the Tanakama. You're allowed to lay it out in private. But Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shimon say no. Anything that the rabbis prohibited, even in private, you're not allowed to do, even though they prohibited it for reasons of appearances. So that's why, for example, let's say you had something that the classic case that the halacha brings is the blood of fish. They used to drink the blood of fish. Fish blood is kosher. Animal blood is not. So what if you had fish blood and you wanted to drink it? You have to put some fish scales in it so people would see that it was fish blood. Okay, what if you're drinking it in private? Nobody needs to know. Still, you had to do it. In the old days, when margarine was new, all of a sudden people would sit down and they'd be eating steak with butter on it. And they'd say, well, what are you doing? You're eating steak with butter. No, it's margarine. It's not butter. Right? So in the beginning, when it was a new thing, or soy milk, soy cheese. So in the beginning, it was so uncommon that there was a real concern. Somebody would see you and they would automatically assume you're eating a cheeseburger. You're eating milk with a burger. Now, it's so common that it's not really considered marita ayin anymore, because it's such a common practice that people don't even assume anything when they see cheese. If it's even, part of cheese is so common, nobody assumes anything. But in the early days when it first came out, it was a concern. So what did they tell you to do? The rabbi said, when soy milk came out, you have to leave the container on the table. So people will see it. Now, even if you're eating alone, you have to do it. Because anything that's marita ayin, afilu b'chadrei chadarim, even in the privacy of your own home, asur. You have to keep the rule of marita ayin. Even though the reason is for appearances, because when the rabbis prohibited it, they prohibited the action. They didn't say it's prohibited when other people can see you. They prohibited it because other people might see you, but that was the reason. But the thing that they prohibited was the action itself. And we'll pick up here tomorrow.